Hello, everyone. I'm Schuyler Erle, and I was actually not originally scheduled to give this presentation today, but I was asked to stand in for Mikkel Marin, who is out busy mapping. So I'm here doing the next best thing, which is talking about mapping. So my name is Schuyler Erle. I work for a company in San Francisco called Simple Geo, and they were kind enough to send me here. So I want to talk to you today about the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. I am, to my knowledge, the only speaker in this community who has clocked in at over 0.9 Andrew Turners. So if I go too fast, please wave your hands around and I'll slow down. I was concerned about not being able to fill the time, but hopefully I will go slow, make myself understood, and we'll get through all of this. So, anyway. The Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, what is it? Well, I imagine that some of you may have already heard of some of our activities, but I wanted to just quickly define the word humanitarian for those of you who are not already familiar with it. In English, the word humanitarian can be used as an adjective, and it means to be concerned with or seeking to promote human welfare. And that's very simple, actually. So the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, quite simply, is trying to help improve people's lives by improving OpenStreetMap. That's what we do. The Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team serves as a connection point between the humanitarian community and the open mapping community. And by the humanitarian community, I mean the UN organizations like the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the International Organization on Migrants, and other kinds of international organizations. We'd like to work with other big NGOs who have a need for mapping, for situational awareness in the event of a disaster. Is primarily what we do. But we're also an advocate for humanitarian work in the open mapping community, and by that I mean you guys. So I was actually, I was in Vienna just a week ago at a conference at the International Center that was run by UN Spider, which is an organization that deals with space-based information within the UN system. And I was there with Nicolas Chauvin and a number of other people, and we were trying to sort of tell these UN people, like, guys, OpenStreetMap, we produce this free data, and it's up to date, and you can get it quickly, and it's accurate, and it rocks, and you guys should use it. And they're all like, oh, that's very interesting. And of course now here, I'm hoping to do the same with you guys and be like, guys, the UN needs our help. And I'm hoping you'll go, oh, very interesting. So, another thing that we do is a collection and organization of free data sources. So as part of this role of sort of trying to provide a point of contact between the humanitarian aid community and the open mapping community, one of the things that we do is we try to get data from them and give it to you guys. In Steve's presentation this morning, he mentioned one of the great successes, recent successes of the OpenStreetMap project, of course, is that we were one of the first mapping services on the web to have boundaries for South Sudan, which I think is a tremendous coup. And I believe, unless I'm sorely mistaken, that we got that data from a UN organization that were able to give it to us under a license that we were able to use to import that into OpenStreetMap. So we're trying to make the relationship between OpenStreetMap and the humanitarian aid community one that is symbiotic. Like I said, we want to try to improve people's lives by improving OpenStreetMap. So towards that end, we're also working on a number of sort of technology projects, which I'll talk about later on, that seek to bolster OSM in various ways to make it more useful for crisis response. And so, of course, the two big things that we do, right, that we try to coordinate are both forms of data creation. One is remote data creation during crisis situations. And the best example of this, of course, is the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti last year. And I'll get into that in a minute. But the other thing that we want to try to do is capacity building before and or after a crisis. So like when a crisis is happening, or there's been an earthquake or a tornado or some other kind of disaster, that is actually the worst time to try instituting new practices or new technologies. in Haiti, we have tried to do some work. We have the field missions on the ground to try to teach people how to use OpenStreetMap, to try to begin developing an OpenStreetMap community that can begin to steward the work that that people have done in mapping the country of Haiti. And there actually is now an active, vibrant OpenStreetMap community in Haiti. I'll also talk later about some work that is now being done by OpenStreetMap volunteers in Indonesia to try to build an OpenStreetMap community there before the next disaster strikes. So that's the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team in a nutshell. So let's look at what happened in Haiti. So you all are familiar. Yeah, I was warned that some of these images were a little large. So you all are familiar, of course, with the earthquake. Magnitude 7.0 happened just outside of Port-au-Prince, which is a city of 1.2 million people. And a substantial number of people were killed. It's interesting, it's not earthquakes that actually kill people, it's buildings falling down on top of them after the earthquake that kills people. So it's important to remember that. Earthquakes themselves are not deadly, it's what happens immediately after the earthquake. This is a photo that I took of the headquarters of the National Mapping Agency in Port-au-Prince. And you can actually, I don't know if you can see, maybe it's a different photo. There's actually a topo map that's like peeking out from under the rubble. So this was the situation that the Haitian government was in immediately after the earthquake in terms of providing geographic information for the response. So you all are familiar, of course, with how OpenStreetMap data is produced. Conventionally, we go out in the world with a GPS receiver and we take some notes, and then we take those notes and we take the GPS data and we digitize them and edit them together and upload it to the database, and that is how our database of the world grows. And most, if not all of you, have done this, and you understand how it works. The problem is, when this happens, it's kind of tough to get in there with a GPS receiver to do any kind of meaningful data creation, because the infrastructure is totally screwed. It's tough to get into the country. Basically, things are a complete nightmare, and people who are in a place like this, in a place like Port-au-Prince after an earthquake, mapping is actually probably one of the last things that they're thinking of doing. But we have access to imagery. And the more imagery, the better. And this is where you guys came in. Over 600 volunteers from the OpenStreetMap community, 600 members of the OpenStreetMap project stepped up and created over 1 million objects in the database in the first few weeks after the quake. And the result, of course, was that we went from nothing. Right, like this, the upper left-hand corner is a map of a city of 1 million people, and there's nothing there, which is the case in many parts of the world. But we got our hands on that imagery and responded. And the amazing thing about this was that you guys responded with virtually no coordination at all. There were no leaders, there was no one in charge. People just stepped up and started mapping using the imagery that we were able to make available. And that's kind of incredible, right? When you think about the fact that we went from this to this, right, and mapped a city of 1.25 million people in a matter of a couple of weeks from outside the country using a wiki page and an IRC channel as our means of coordination. Guys, this has never happened before, and it's incredible. It is absolutely incredible. So if you have not already given yourself a pat on the back for participating in this effort or for being part of a community that made this possible, then you should. Because it is totally unprecedented. For the first time, I'm going to say this one more time just to make it really clear. For the first time in history, right, people were able to substantially and materially benefit the safety of other people in crisis from clear across the world, right, from the safety of from the comfort of your own couch, your living room, your office, your dining room table. So the OpenStreetMap data got used everywhere. If this is redundant for some of you guys, I'll try to blow through it. But so it got used in Ushahidi. Ushahidi reports came in via text message. These text messages were translated, and then they went back out into the hands of, for example, the U.S. Army Southern Command, and they were used to try to pull people out from, among other things, collapsed buildings. Here's an urban search and rescue worker. This is a terrible photograph because it was taken from close range, but this is a guy, he actually has OpenStreetMap data on his Garmin, and he's a search and rescue worker from the US who's working in Haiti. The OpenStreetMap data found its way onto Gaia GPS, which is an iPhone app, and that prompted this guy, who was from the European Commission Humanitarian Aid team, to come into the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs tent in Port-au-Prince at the logistics base and say, I need maps for my truck drivers, and what I want is OpenStreetMap. Well, Google Maps would be okay, but what I really want is OpenStreetMap. This guy is he's not a geek, he's not a nerd, he's not a mapper, he's not a hacker. This is a guy who works for a humanitarian aid team, right? But he knew when he walked into that tent that OpenStreetMap had the best data for Haiti. This was probably about a month after the disaster. And so the data that we produced got used by an organization called Map Action. They're a nonprofit whose role is to serve as a sort of a cartographic first responder. And Map Action's maps wound up in the hands of virtually every UN agency that was working on the ground in Port-au-Prince. And guys, it has your data in it. And one of the organizers of Map Action said to me, and I quote, "Without a doubt, OpenStreetMap has helped to save lives." So the OpenStreetMap community, the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, was formed around this time, and we sent 4 missions to Haiti with the European Commission Humanitarian Office and with the International Organization on Migrants. And we had several people on the ground for several months, including Kate Chapman, Nicolas Chavon, Robert Soden, and a bunch of other people. And they helped develop a team called the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap de Haiti, or COSMA, I guess. And this is a group in Haiti based in Cité Soleil, which is actually one of the poorer parts of the city. And they have taken it upon themselves to start to maintain the map and to continue to develop the map. And it's kind of ironic now because Port-au-Prince is probably one of the best mapped cities in the entire Western Hemisphere as a result. So we made the magic happen once, right? Like somehow people came together and were able to use satellite and aerial imagery to produce a whole bunch of data in OpenStreetMap. And the question is, of course, could we do it again? And the answer is basically no, actually. In Pakistan, the area, the number of people affected by the floods in Pakistan last spring was vastly larger than the number of people affected by the earthquake in Haiti. And we were not, for the most part, able to produce. We did add some data to the OpenStreetMap project, but not as much as we should have or as we could have. And the answer, the reason why not, is because we couldn't get the imagery. Right? The amount of the amount of attention by the global press on the earthquake in Haiti pried loose imagery from commercial satellite providers, commercial satellite operators, who said, "Oh, well, we want to help. Here, we'll give you some imagery." But because the floods in Pakistan were less acute, they were more prolonged, and they were less well covered by the global media, or at least they certainly were less well covered in the United States. There was less kind of pressure to say, "Oh, well, we'll make this imagery available, but we have to have the imagery in order to be able to do the remote mapping." Remember, the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team does 2 things, right? Remote mapping using imagery and capacity building on the ground, right? So this is remote mapping using imagery. This is people teaching each other how to use OpenStreetMap in workshops, trying to build community, and those are the 2 things we do, right? And if we can't go there and we can't get the imagery, then we can't help. There have been a number of Humanitarian OpenStreetMap activations since then. There's been one for Côte d'Ivoire. We were able to get some WMS services from Spot Image. And I think the imagery was like about 2 meters per pixel, about 2-meter resolution, which is good enough for us to be able to do things like map buildings and map major roads and so on. And I mean, again, if you can imagine, like this is the Abidjan, which I believe is the capital of Côte d'Ivoire, and the map is extremely detailed. I mean, you can see at least most of the transport network in the city has been added. We also activated for Libya, and this was in coordination with the Crisis Mappers Standby Task Force. And the Crisis Mappers group is a kind of an informal organization of people on the web that grew up after the earthquake in Haiti, and they've started a somewhat more formal organization called the Standby Task Force. This is a bunch of people, much like yourselves, who have the time and the interest and the technical capability to get online and to participate in projects like Ushahidi, and to work on taking reports that come in via text message, for example, and put them on a map. And collect all of that information. And in Libya, for the first time, right, so this is Benghazi, which is another city which looks pretty damn good in OSM, I have to say. You'll notice here, this logo up here, OCHA, this is the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And they actually explicitly asked, for the first time a UN organization came to an informal organization of people like us and said, "Please help us." because the United Nations has not had a presence inside Libya for over 30 years. Right, and when the revolution started in Libya, the UN, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, they didn't have anybody in the country, and they didn't have a very good way of getting a picture of the humanitarian situation there. And so they turned to the Crisis Mappers Standby Task Force and said, please help us build a map to collect reports that are coming out of Libya to try and get a sense of what is the situation, what is the kind of the overall picture of what's going on there. And of course, as you can see, sure enough, that's all OpenStreetMap data that they're using underneath. And so it is important to recognize all of the places that our data can be used. Like I said, I was at a meeting here in Vienna last week on crowdsourced mapping, and one of the representatives of the Crisis Mappers Standby Task Force stood up and said, you know, look, we need OpenStreetMap to function in the event of a disaster. We need their data because we can't do what we do without the work that they do. And by they mean you guys, right? So we help to make Libya Crisis Map possible. But there's some interesting things here, right? Because now we're dealing with situations that are not purely a matter of humanitarian or disaster relief, right? There's a sort of question of, well, it's one thing when you have somebody who's on the ground in a disaster and they have a GPS and they're collecting map data, they're uploading it to OpenStreetMap. But what happens when you're in a situation which is not purely a natural disaster? How do you deal with that? I don't actually have any good answers. I'm just sort of raising the question, right? One of the things that I think we as a community have not thought a whole lot about is how do we support people for whom mapping is dangerous? And possibly not dangerous because it is unsafe for reasons of climate or meteorology, but unsafe because other people are making it unsafe for them. How do we support them? Do we want to support them? I don't have answers to this, but these considerations play into the development of a project like the Libya Crisis Map. So there was the earthquake recently in Japan, and the OpenStreetMap community did a tremendous amount of work on OSM in Japan. I don't have a whole lot to say about this because the places like Japan and I'll get into in a minute New Zealand are interesting because in a lot of ways they're kind of already mapped. I mean, the OSM community in Japan is quite strong. And as you can see, the data that we have in the database right now for this part, for the Sendai region, is also quite good. And so it's sort of interesting because when we get into disaster mapping in more developed areas, in richer parts of the world, then the role of the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team changes somewhat because what we're mapping now is not infrastructure, but situation, right? So for example, in Haiti, not only did we map streets, but we also wound up mapping things like IDP camps, refugee camps. And so these kinds of dynamic situations, these kinds of things that are not already on the base map are the sort of thing that we need to think about, like how do we want to add that to OpenStreetMap? How do we want to add that capability to represent these things which are a bit more dynamic, right, like IDP camps? So these are questions. One thing that is interesting about this is that the earthquake in Japan was the first time that we inverted the equation of wealth in the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap community. Typically, and this is the way that humanitarian aid works, rich people help poor people. And that's where the help goes, because that's where the help is available and where it's needed. But in Japan, actually, we had this interesting twist where members of the OpenStreetMap community in Haiti helped map Japan in the aftermath of their disaster, which I thought was really fantastic. This is a way in which the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, by helping to develop local capacity and by working in an organized way to build the OpenStreetMap community in parts of the world where it does not exist, we reap benefits because then the people who get into OSM can then contribute back and can help other people when they are in trouble. So I thought that was pretty awesome. So New Zealand, the Christchurch earthquake. I don't have much to say about that because if you go and look at the wiki page for this earthquake in the OpenStreetMap wiki, it's quite interesting. It says like, well, there's not much for us to do because Christchurch is already mapped. So, I mean, in a sense, like, we almost kind of hope that the long-term success of the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team will lead to its own demise, right? Like, we actually want HOT to work so well that it is not necessary anymore because all of the things that might be mapped relevant to a disaster have already been. And so that brings us to Indonesia. And right now we have, I want to say, 4 people on the ground in Indonesia, led by Kate Chapman and Jeff Hake. And they are working with the Australia-Indonesia Facility for Disaster Reduction, or AIFDR, and the World Bank's Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, which is GFDRR, and also the Indonesian National, I can't pronounce that, the BNPB is the Indonesian National Disaster Agency. And so these organizations are working together with the help of the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team to host OpenStreetMap workshops in villages in every single district in the entire country. Right? And this is a pilot program, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out whether it is possible for a small cell of Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team members to go around and teach enough people in each district that they can then go and teach people in other towns in the same district, and we can seed in a sort of a kind of a pyramid style a functioning OpenStreetMap community for the entirety of Indonesia and map all of Indonesia, possibly even down to the building level before the next disaster happens. Now, obviously, this is a very ambitious project, which is why this is just a pilot. But what's going on here actually is they're having events at, I believe, 4 or 5 different universities, and there is a competition for university teams to see which team can map their area the best, and there's a cash prize. So obviously, you know, we need to work with international organizations that are interested in not just disaster relief, but disaster prevention or disaster mitigation, and try to essentially leverage their funding and their resources to teach them how to do something that they've never done before, which is enable individual people, you know, students and technically minded people who live in places that might someday be affected by disaster, and give them the tools to map their communities first, so that the risk can be understood and the hazards mitigated. So this is a map of the provinces in Indonesia and some of the places where the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team will be working. And the future. Well, all right, let's talk about the future. So this is what HOT has done thus far, right? We've been at it for about 1.5 years. Quite frankly, I'm really personally encouraged by the results that we have thus far. I think that the OpenStreetMap community has demonstrated conclusively to the international humanitarian aid community that we're for serious. We're not fooling around. We're not a bunch of amateurs. Well, maybe we are a bunch of amateurs, but we're really good amateurs. We're really good at what we do. We have made more sophisticated maps of various parts of the world faster than anyone in the UN could do it without our help, and they're starting to take notice. So, how do we take the work that we have done in trying to help people, trying to improve people's lives by improving OSM, and push that further? Well, so one thing that we'd like to do is to coordinate more closely with Map Action. Map Action is, as I mentioned, an organization whose role is to just, they sort of parachute in at the first sign of a disaster, and they start mapping like crazy. And their Map Action, these guys are real like traditional GIS people. They work with ArcGIS. They really like the idea of OpenStreetMap. The representative from Map Action at the meeting at the International Center last week said the same thing. Incidentally, said the same thing that the representative from the Standby Task Force said, which was, we can't do what we do without OpenStreetMap, so we need their help. We need them to be able to do their work. So Map Action are 100% behind us, and we them. I kind of view them in the event of a disaster as being kind of the #1 customer of the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. These are the people who will use the data that we produce to help other people. We need to figure out as a community on our end, right? How do we reduce the burden on Map Action of using our data, right? So we're talking about not just like, oh, let's get some imagery and map the heck out of the places that we have imagery for, put that data in the OpenStreetMap database, okay, we're done. Actually, we're not done, because at that point we now have to find a way to take the data that we have all collectively produced and put it into a form that can be used by these guys. right? So we have to get the data into GIS formats in a way that is reasonably sensible. So part of this is working out kind of a crosswalk or a translation from the map features sort of schema, if you will, that we use within the OSM community, and map our tags into attributes and features that the humanitarian aid, the humanitarian rescue community is actually able to use. So this is a set of presets that have been developed for SotM, specifically for doing humanitarian mapping. So we've started to work on kind of these bits of technology to try to smooth the transition between the OpenStreetMap world and the more traditional GIS-focused humanitarian aid world. We've also put together some OSM kits. So we've got a laptop and some GPS receivers, and so we've been working on this idea of like, all right, well, if we needed to OpenStreetMap the heck out of a town or a village, you know, on 24 hours notice, how do we do it? Well, pack up the Pelican cases, guys. But that's actually not really the answer to the overwhelming majority of the mapping needs that, that disaster response has. So we have to get our hands on imagery. And the tricky part here is, of course, there are three primary sources of imagery. But the two primary sources are commercial sources and public sources, right? And the public sources, I mean, mostly national space agencies that have satellites that provide imagery. And then by commercial sources, I mean companies that actually shoot satellites into space at their own expense and have to recoup that expense for the benefit of their shareholders. For better or worse, the best sources of imagery out there are almost uniformly commercial. The commercial satellites are newer, usually, and they have higher resolution imagery. So it's fine for us to go begging to them hat in hand and say, well, there are people in trouble over here. Can we have imagery, please? And for the most part, some of them, well, after Haiti, pretty much every company out there with an imagery satellite was very accommodating. But since then, they have been less forthcoming. Spot Image is the notable exception. They've been really great. However, we do have this thing called the Space Charter, which I love the name of this. The official name of the treaty is the International Charter, Space and Natural Disasters. There is no preposition in there, and I do not know why. Bugs the heck out of me. However, it is colloquially referred to by people within the United Nations as the Space Charter. And the Space Charter basically is an international agreement between countries that have space agencies that allows them to call upon each other for assistance in order to get access to imagery in the event of a disaster, right? And they call this activating the charter, as in, and I love to say this is my favorite thing to say ever, activate the Space Charter! But doesn't that sound awesome? I love saying that. God. Anyway, so once the Space Charter gets activated, right, then the UN can get access to imagery for the benefit of UN agencies. And this is the point at which we come in and go, ooh, we can help, ooh, give us imagery. The problem that we're facing right now is that we can actually get unlimited quantities of imagery at the highest resolutions possible, but only under a non-commercial use license, which is a problem for us. And I hate to drag out the whole licensing issue again, but here we are. So this is where we're at right now, is essentially the U.S. Geological Survey in particular are like, well, we'll give you all the imagery you want, so long as you're, following this particular bureaucratic process. Oh, and the imagery can't be used for any kind of commercial purpose. And obviously the OpenStreetMap is not intrinsically a commercial purpose, but it is necessary for us to be able to publish our data in a way that allows commercial reuse. So this is a kind of a tricky one. Now, I personally think, and this is my opinion, that if you are in a part of the world that has been hit by a disaster, and after the disaster, during the recovery phase, somebody wants to build a business that uses OpenStreetMap data, and that will help your economy, I think that's probably awesome. That's probably good for your disaster recovery. But this is a thing that we're working on. But anyway, another thing that we can do is, if we can't get satellite or aerial imagery from the imagery providers, is we can make our own. So this is a diagram from the guys at grassrootsmapping.org. They actually have recently expanded their operations. They're known as Public publiclaboratory.org, and they got a whole bunch of money from, they'll be available online, by the way, guys, so you'll have access to all this stuff. They are in the process of doing a bunch of research, trying to figure out what is the most cost-effective way to capture ground imagery using stuff that you can basically buy off the shelf. And I think this is pretty awesome. So I'm really excited to work with these guys in the future. This is a diagram for a project called OpenAerialMap, which is the thing that I personally am most excited about. OpenAerialMap, basically, what we're hoping it will, the project has been around as an idea for a long time. There's been a whole lot of interest in it. But OpenAerialMap kind of falls down in some ways as a sort of a crowdsourced participation project. What we would like it to be is sort of, if you will, the satellite tab on OpenStreetMap, right? We'd like OpenAerialMap to be a free and open archive of aerial and satellite imagery for the entire world. Now, as you can imagine, this is a big job. The vectors, while we have tons of them in the OSM database, are relatively compact. Now, when you download that Planet OSM, you're thinking that's not a compact database at all. But relative to the amount of imagery that we could conceivably have for the entire world, the Planet OSM file is a pittance. It's nothing. So the problem that we're trying to deal with right now is how to develop free software that will allow us to distribute the storage of all of the aerial and satellite imagery that we could conceivably have across the internet in a scalable and redundant way. So that it can be used not just by the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, but by anyone who has a need for ground imagery, whether it's related to OSM or not. This is an ongoing process. Like I said, it's been very hard to get people to volunteer for to work on the OpenAerialMap project. I think it's partly because, honestly, like, you guys remember when you first got access to satellite imagery of some kind, it was Google Maps or whatever, and you were like, "Ooh, I'm going to go look at my house." Right? Y'all did that, right? That's exactly what I did. And then what do you do after that? You're like, "Oh, that was cool." Click. And you don't really go back to it unless you need it to trace imagery. And so I think whereas OpenStreetMap for us as a project, as a participatory project, allows us to fill all kinds of different needs, the OpenAerialMap need is not actually so strong until there's an earthquake or there's a typhoon or something and we need to map an area that has not been mapped previously. So we're trying to work out how to get the resources to support this project. But there is some software that already exists. The concept has been proven. There is a mailing list. I think it's lists.openaerialmap.org. So this community is still very embryonic. But we're hoping to grow it and hoping to grow the technology around it and start hoovering up all of the imagery we can lay hands on. Right now we have the entire world from Landsat 7 at 15-meter resolution, and we have the whole US from the NAIP dataset at 1 meter, which is awesome. I'd love to have 1 meter resolution for the world. So that's what we're working on. How can you get involved? I bet you've been wondering this for the last 40 minutes. So how you get involved, actually, there's a number of different ways. Much like OpenStreetMap, generally, the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team is focused both on software and on data, right? So producing data is only part of what we do. And in fact, we do have a need to develop new tools to support things like, for example, there's a tasking server that we've been working on for methodically mapping a particular area so that people can sort of check in and check out particular regions. So if you're interested in getting involved, that would be one way that you could do that. We have a number of kind of ongoing activations. Tragically, disasters happen basically all the time. So if you have spare time and you're interested, there's of course also there's a Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team mailing list, which I believe is hosted with the other OSM mailing lists, so it should be pretty easy to find. And if you're interested, if you have time, this is something I really want to participate in, we really need your help, please do get on the mailing list. And if you don't have time for that, and you say like, oh, well, this Humanitarian OpenStreetMap thing is a really cool idea, but I don't really have time for it, we do still need your help, right? Because there will be another tsunami or another earthquake, and we are going to need experienced OpenStreetMap contributors to come and devote an hour or two, right? And, every time there's a disaster, people go, oh, we should all wear a ribbon, or we should give $10 to the Red Cross. And if you want to give 10 euros to the Red Cross or whatever, by all means you should do that. But you guys are in a unique position. You can actually seriously help people with your own efforts from your own computer when those people are in need. So what I would say is actually probably the biggest need we have, the thing that I would like to ask of all of you is, the next time there's a disaster, the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team will send messages out, not just to the HOT list, but probably also the OSM talk list, and say, hey guys, we need to surge mappers on this particular area. We have the imagery. We have to map the heck out of it so that, you know, the UN knows what it's doing or the Red Cross knows what it's doing. And that's the point at which we really need your help. So if you guys would just keep that in mind, please. The next time you see a disaster mentioned on the news, just check out the OSM mailing lists. So check out the OSM wiki. Are people working on this? Because we could definitely use your help. And I think that was about all I had to say. Check out the blog, hotopenstreetmap.org. We also have a ton of information on the OpenStreetMap wiki. My name is Schuyler Erle. I'm from Simple Geo. I really enjoyed talking to you guys today. Do you have any questions? Please.
Yeah, do you know if there is any imagery for the Misrata area in Libya? Because that's also probably much.
Sorry. For technical reasons, we are recording this, and I'd like to repeat the question.
I'll repeat the question, yes. Okay. All right, so the question was, do we have any imagery of the Misrata area in Libya due to the ongoing crisis there? The short answer is I don't know, but I did see a mail go over the mailing list about how the battle lines have now crossed into the high-resolution imagery in Bing. So thanks to the combatants in Libya for that. We'll be sure to start mapping. Question in the back.
Subsidiary explanation about that is something about outreach. The kids on the road came along running a couple of people of Pakistani origin going by their way. Reminded me of when I was their age, I was collecting money for Biafra in Nigeria. But we don't make outreach into these communities, for instance, it might be possible to reach local mosques and so on, where people might be able to make this kind of activity. I don't know how to do it, but it's supposed to get it. On the map action, on enabling traditional GIS use of our data, I think there are a lot of technological problems that we haven't dealt with address. Things like asynchronous mapping, the ability of people in the crisis zones to map and then synchronize with the database. We really map something. We don't have any kind of system like these, so we can bring data between other data, and we need much more sophisticated tools for history. All of those are, I think it needs to be done to help that happen. And one last thing, I deliberately did not map in Libya because I was concerned that putting friends at the time that we were starting them. So it's not just data maps, but also because we were having communications to try to find out what happened to them. I thought it was unwise to actually do any mapping when idea questions,
So if I could just recap those briefly, because I have like literally a minute. Thank you very much for those comments. You touched on a number of things that I wanted to bring up, and I wasn't sure if I would have time. So the first point, of course, it's gratifying to hear, I guess in some sense, gratifying to hear that we weren't the only ones that had trouble with Pakistan. And that was a disaster of unimaginable scale. And the crisis mappers community have started to do some work on doing outreach to what they call diaspora communities, right? Like you were saying, people who are from the country affected, who live outside that country and therefore have local knowledge. This was used by the Ushahidi community after the earthquake in Haiti. A lot of the street names and so on in the OpenStreetMap database actually come from people who are from Port-au-Prince but who live outside the country, who are going through and annotating that data. Because, of course, we can't get things like street names from imagery, right? So we do need to find ways to do outreach to enlist the participation of expat communities. And I have 1 minute, so I will say, yes, one last thing about disaster relief. which is, as you pointed out, the actual relief situation itself is an unbelievably nightmarish, hectic thing where there's so much going on at once that no single person keep track of it all. And most people that I've seen in these circumstances really kind of struggle quite hard with just being bombarded by all the information that they have. Right? On top of that, they have basically no internet access, or they have a tiny trickle of internet access. Just real quickly, one of the things that I did while I was at the OCHA mapping tent with the Map Action kids in Port-au-Prince was I was talking to them about their use of OpenStreetMap data, and they were like, "Oh, we're having trouble getting updates." I'm like, "Oh, well, we'll just go to the GeoFabrique server and we'll click download, and look, it's only 14 megabytes." "Oh, 14 megabytes? Dear God, don't download that." Why not? Well, first, right, they're on the BGAN link, satellite link. It's already saturated, so they're at like 30 kilobits. It was going to take an hour, and BGAN costs $7 a megabyte. So that download was going to cost $100. So this is just a little bit of perspective to think about the kinds of challenges, the technical challenges that we have in terms of trying to take what we do and distill it down so that it can be used by people who have a desperate need. Anyway, thank you all so much for your time. I really appreciate it.